Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's event. I am Qian Ge, co-chair of NECAA. NECAA is a non-profit organization. It is born out of We Start Alliance. During the harsh time of COVID-19, We Start Alliance donated 670,000 pieces of PPE in both China and the USA. As COVID-19 cases run rampant, both here in the US and around the globe, anti-AAPI hate crimes surged too. Most of this hate stems from the misinformation that flood online social media platforms and the general ignorance of the AAPI experiences as a whole, which is why NECAA is hosting this series of lectures. NECAA aims to bring the AAPI experiences into the public attention and create conversation around such a topic. This is the second event of NECAA's Roundtable series of Restore the Rightful Place of AAPI History in K-12 education. It is our great honor to have three panelists here, David Buchanan, Anping Shen, and Li Song Liu. And let me introduce today's moderator, Mr. Ben Xia, President of Floodwood Foundation, Deputy Secretary General, Chinese School Association in the United States. 有请夏明.
Thank you so much, Ge-Qian, and welcome everyone. And it's my great honor to be here with all the three distinguished speakers. It's my great honor to have David Buchanan and Li Song Liu and Dr. Anping Shen. And this is our second series roundtable talk and regarding the AI history. I hope you will enjoy this one. So let me introduce our first speaker, David Buchanan. He is the director of Massachusetts programs at iCivic, leading professional development and advocacy initiatives to improve civic education across the state. Prior to his work with iCivics, Dave worked for 18 years at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, where he serves as assistant director of the Office of Literacy and Humanities and led the revision of the Massachusetts History and Social Science curriculum framework from 2016 to 18. Dave holds a Master in Education from UMass-Boston and a Bachelor in History from Middlebury College. All of his work is rooted in his experience over more than 15 years as a teacher of history, literacy, and ESL in a variety of settings with many different populations, including English learners and learning disabled students. Let's welcome David.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for that welcome, and it's great to be here. I'm going to shift over here and share screen, as I have a presentation I'd like to make with all of you. And I do really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you this evening. And I certainly appreciate the fact that all of you are taking your evening to focus on this particularly important topic in these days. So as Ben said, I am the director of Massachusetts programs at iCivics and have been there for 3 years. My background is really, as he said, I was originally a teacher for many years, and following that, I worked at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, where I became friends with Anping, actually. I was a manager there for 3 years, and I was also led the revision of the History and Social Science framework, as Ben said. I have experience in teaching ESL, so I've done a good bit of work with second language learners. And I also have a personal history that I think is particularly pertinent to this group. And that is that I have some family history in terms of some relatives who did some work in China with a nonprofit many years ago. I did study Chinese history in college, although my memory of some of that is pretty dim at this point. And unfortunately, I've never really been to Asia, but the closest I came to that was very close to joining the Peace Corps in Papua New Guinea. I didn't end up going there, and I wound up working in Nicaragua in Central America for a year instead. And I just bring that up because I do have a a deep interest in international affairs and also have had the experience of living overseas for some time, which I think is important. I also have a personal interest in Zen Buddhism, which I think may be pertinent a little bit to some of this as well. So I do work at iCivics. I've been there for 3 years, and I'm the director of Massachusetts programs. As Ben said, I lead some, particularly the work we do around professional development for teachers in Massachusetts. And I'm also very involved in a lot of the work we are involved with many other organizations around advocacy for civic education and making improvements in that, including the passage of the 2018 Civics law that's been very important in the last couple of years here in Massachusetts. I do work at iCivics. My comments tonight are really my own. I'm not here representing iCivics, so I just ask you to keep that in mind. iCivics, if you're not familiar with it, is a nonprofit that's been around for 10 years. It was founded by Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. And we're particularly well known for a set of digital games that are available for free, as are almost all of our materials, that really engage students in taking on certain roles in our civic life. So becoming president and running a campaign to become president, for example, or running a law firm, or becoming a Supreme Court justice, or any number of other games particularly. So those are kind of what we're well known for. We have a host of other resources, including many that are focused on supporting English learners. And I think it's particularly important to bring up the work that I do in iCivics, because I think that is pertinent to a lot of what you're trying to do here in terms of engaging students and addressing the situation in education, and also some of the advocacy that you're engaged in around the Asian American issues in Massachusetts and nationally as well. So the other thing I'll just mention here is that iCivics is one of the lead organizations, along with many others, that have organized the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition. It's been around for almost 4 years now, and was very much a champion for the civics law that passed in 2018. And we continue to advocate for continued funding to make sure that good quality civics education is happening for all students in all districts, regardless of zip code and regardless of their demographic background. We have a number of resources posted on our website, and we have a pretty active marketing organization to try to gain increased support for civic education nationally, or in the state anyway. And I would just actually encourage all of you to think about whether you might want to become a member of the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition at some point as well. We would certainly welcome that, and we're looking to really diversify our member group for that organization. So keep that in mind if you would. So tonight, I just want to talk a little bit about the current situation with Asian American racism and the very alarming increase in the number of attacks on Asian Americans in the United States, across the country, just in the last year even, but we could certainly look to previous years as well as being quite alarming. And I think all of us on this session tonight are quite committed to the idea that a threat to justice for anybody is really a threat to justice to any of us, and that we're all really interconnected. So that's one of the key ideas, I think, that sort of undergirds what I'd like to say tonight, as well as the fact that policies and practices really feed hate. It's not just the action of certain individuals. And I think it's important to think about what's happening in our country, both for Asian Americans, for other groups, and on other issues as well, that we are all interconnected and that it is a systemic issue and we need to address it systemically. So a couple of the key levers for change that are quite obvious to all of you are creating change around policy, and it sounds like you're already becoming very active around legislation and whatnot. And then of course, education, which is the focus of what I want to talk about tonight. So you're all quite well acquainted, I'm sure, with the the new laws that have been passed or are in Congress under consideration right now, most particularly the Hate Crimes Act, COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act that the president just signed. And then the Teaching Asian Pacific American History Act, which could provide some additional funding for teaching content particularly relevant to that population. So that's the legislative part of this, and I'm not really going to dig further into that because I'm sure you're all well acquainted with that. But in terms of education, as I understand it, the main question that you've been considering is, and that sounds like the main strategy that you're thinking of, is to advocate for the revision of the history and social science framework. And that, as you know, from what I said earlier and what Ben said, I did lead the revision of the history framework. I can't say I'm the author of that. It was certainly the work of many people. We had a panel of 40 educators from across the state who participated and advised on that over the course of over a year and a half. We did multiple surveys, public surveys, to get input from the public. There were reports back to the board in the course of the whole process. And we took a whole lot of public comment, both written and through that survey. So a lot of all of that was really integrated into the framework. And it's, you know, I think that speaks to the fact that it is a pretty complex process. It takes a couple of years to do that. And particularly in this content area, history and social science particularly is quite political. And what I mean by that is everybody has an interest in this, and everybody has a perspective, and often a strong perspective on that. And so the creation of the framework as we know it was really a compromise of many of those different points of view. And I think there's been significant improvements over the previous framework, which dates back to 2003, actually, quite many years back. But it's a compromise document, like most public documents, and there's always room for improvement. So I recognize that. My advice actually to all of you is actually not to be focused on that so much, because I do not think it's likely to be up for revision for quite some time. The revision cycle for all of the frameworks, all of the different subject area frameworks, there's quite a number of years between the revision cycles. I do hope it's going to be more frequent than it was prior to this for history and social science. But I think it's really considered that the 2018 framework is really considered a relatively new revision, and I really doubt that it's going to be up for a new revision. My advice really is to think about how we might best get important resources that support the focus on Asian American issues and Asian American history and so forth into the hands of teachers to use that in their classrooms. And one of the possible avenues for making that happen is to consider submitting a set of materials that could be used in the updating of a supporting supplement. So there is a supplemental document to the framework that is much more easily revised. In fact, it was revised in December of 2018. So that was after the June approval by the board and all of that for the main framework. So it's quite likely there could be another update in the next year, or I really can't speak to the timeline on that, but much more likely to happen in a shorter period of time than a revision of the whole framework. And there's no board approval required for that revision. It's something that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education can do independent of that. So that's a recommendation. And I'll just speak some more in the rest of the presentation here about some considerations in developing that set of resources that might be included in this work, and perhaps in making those resources available elsewhere as well, so that teachers have good access to them. So in thinking about other options, I think it is important that we take into consideration and think about what are some of the main stories. There's real power in stories, and the stories of history particularly. And in fact, I would add really that it's the many stories coming together that make our history particularly engaging and particularly important for students, and give them a much fuller perspective on the past and where we are today. So if they're not exposed to all of those stories, or at least many of them, they don't get that full sense of our history and have a full understanding of why things are the way they are today. So that's number one point. The second one here is I think it's important to make sure that the stories and the narratives that we're including in our history are not only stories of trials that any group has endured in the course of their history, but also about stories of success and empowerment. So we can look at a lot of the major labor that went into the development of the Transcontinental Railroad, for example, and the major role that Chinese workers had in making that happen. And that type of history is included in the framework, but and the Japanese internment, of course, is an important piece of our history as well, as another example. But we also need to look to the major contributions that many Asian Americans have made to the business world and to government and any other of the other many avenues of our society. So I would just encourage a perspective that takes into account all of those stories as you think about the type of material that we want to make available for teachers to use. I would also just suggest here that we need to really teach more than the narratives and the stories of history. If we look back in history ourselves and look back to the 1930s, for example, and what was happening in Germany, and the rise of the Nazis, there were a lot of very highly educated Nazis. So education and an understanding of some of the history itself is not sufficient, I think. And I think what we need to focus on is, well, some of what Kuan Yin might suggest to us as the Bodhisattva of compassion, that we need to start to teach more thoroughly what compassion is and what empathy is, and help students to develop those skills that can support that. So along with those, there's some other skills I've mentioned here as well, but I'll just mention that in many schools, as you're probably aware, there's a lot of focus right now on social emotional learning, often referred to as SEL. There's an organization that is particularly promoting that, and they've put together quite an elaborate and detailed framework for integrating SEL into the curriculum in most content areas. We have it actually incorporated into history and social science framework in Massachusetts on purpose. And really the root of that is to really offer students an opportunity to develop skills around monitoring themselves, having a self-awareness about what they're feeling emotionally and their reaction to whatever they're learning, self-management, that responsible decision-making that you see listed there, relationship skills, and social awareness. And I think all of those skills, if you think about that, are really important for developing students' ability to listen to other people and to have at least enough perspective to listen well and try to understand and have some empathy for other people's perspectives. And certainly we see a lack of some of that in our society right now, a lack of civility and an inability to understand each other's perspectives. So this SEL piece, I think, is particularly important as we think about how to best address racial issues in this country, including those that are impacting Asian Americans here in the US as well. I've included a couple of other skills here that I think are particularly important, developing critical thinking skills, of course, and then also giving students an opportunity to understand how they can actually take action in their own communities to bring about change, even if it's on a very small scale, just to give them that experience of what it is to participate in our civic life. So again, going back to my current work with iCivics, I think it's particularly important that we maintain a focus on that and give students those opportunities to really try out what they're learning, not just learn about civics or learn about history, but to become part of that and to really engage with it.
Oh, excuse me, Dave.
That we really need to be supporting teachers in gaining the instructional strategies that can support this kind of work, particularly the critical thinking and the study of contemporary issues. this is a tricky world we live in. You know, we're living in a world where people operate from different sets of facts at this point, and we need to have the ability to try to keep discussions of those topics, and it is important to have those in schools to expose students to these contemporary issues, but we need to do it in a way that provides some structure for that, and so that it goes in a productive direction rather than getting off into just individuals' opinions and so forth. So one example of what I'm talking about here is that we, as educators, are starting to use much more often some
David,
yes.
there might be a question for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wonder, your slides is not on, so you just intentionally not turn on your slides, or just like some accident?
I was screen sharing. I'm not sure why that is not the case.
Oh, we were not be able to see.
No problem. We can see it again. Don't worry. You can run it again.
But
Just to show the slides.
Okay, I apologize for that. I mustn't have been screen sharing.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Can you see the slides now?
yeah,
Yes.
probably can go through quickly first few things you went through.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay, so let's see, I could back up, I guess, and explain this a little bit further if you want, but what would you like to do?
Probably just go through quickly, at least refresh our memory, but you don't need to spend time to.
Okay, so introduce myself.
Yeah.
Talk about iCivics and explain a little bit about the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition. And I talked about our commitment to understanding that we're all connected and that there's some certain key levers for change, particularly around policy and education, as well as some of the current legislation federally that's been enacted or is in process in Congress right now. I also talked about the framework and the idea of revising the resources to support that, and mentioned some of, some examples of Asian American history that are particularly important, and the idea that they should include successes as well as some of the trials that previous generations have gone through in our history. And then I did share this framework that I was just talking about with SEL, social emotional learning, with the idea that teachers are trying to incorporate some of these, helping students learn some of these skills, these social emotional learning skills that are particularly important for students to gain an understanding of other perspectives and where other people are coming from in discussion and otherwise. And then my point I was just making a moment ago is just that it's important to structure these discussions in a way that's productive. And one way to do that is to set some ground rules at the beginning of discussions, which many teachers are doing nowadays, as you may know. This is just one example of that, but it's getting a commitment at the beginning of a discussion and setting that as a routine for ongoing discussions over the course of a school year with a given set of students. So staying engaged, speaking your truth, you might be experiencing discomfort, but to stick with it. And in this case, maybe there's some discussions that there won't be closure on. So that's just one simple example of the kind of guidance that teachers are offering to students that can help keep these discussions on track. So one example of a way to do this well is the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, which just came out a few months ago. iCivics, among a number of other organizations, including Harvard and University of Arizona, Circle, which is based at Tufts in Boston, and a number of other organizations were very actively involved as the leaders in developing this. And this was through a rather large NEH grant over about 2 years, and it involved about over 300 scholars and educators in the development of it. But there's a lot to it, and I'm not going to go into details of it tonight, but basically the idea is to provide some guidance for educators as well as policymakers about how to teach civics and history in an integrated way, so they're coming together well and that students get a more comprehensive understanding of our history and how they can play a role in our civic life. So you see that there's key themes that are listed here around the globe circle you see there, which various aspects of our history. And a lot of the root of the foundation of the Educating for American Democracy are these design challenges, 5 of them. And you'll see that they're really challenging educators to think about how to teach particular issues in our history. So this idea of motivating agency, how do we students understand their own role in participating in our civic life? America's plural yet shared history. So one I think that's particularly pertinent to tonight's discussion about how we think about how to include the narratives of the many people that make up our population here in the US now. And to do that across the grades, not just in one grade, but right from kindergarten on up to grade 12. And then you see the others listed here, celebrating, critiquing, compromise, civic honesty, and reflective patriotism, and balancing the concrete and the abstract in the way we teach history. So this is this roadmap, the EID roadmap that I'm talking about here, really is an opportunity to bring together different perspectives in an organized way that hopefully doesn't overwhelm teachers, but helps to organize the way they would present the narratives of Asian Americans, along with many others in the curriculum. And you can see there's a breakdown of some additional questions here that help guide the thinking about the development of curriculum that does that. So again, we're not going to go way into detail on that right now, and I'm happy to answer some more questions in a little bit if you'd like to discuss that further. But it is one thing that I think is worth considering as a way to start to address racial issues across the board, not only those of Asian Americans, but it is a systemic issue that we have for all groups in our country, really. The other thing I just mentioned here is that you're probably familiar with the work of Facing History. They're based in Brookline and have been around for many, many years and have a very solid reputation in the education world. Have done a lot of work, particularly around helping students to understand the history and to challenge teachers and students to stand up to bigotry and hate. A lot of their focus originally was around the Holocaust and the history of that. They've expanded it massively in recent years, particularly to many, many other episodes in our own history in the US as well as internationally. And they're really trying to help students to connect choices made in the past to some of the choices they're likely to encounter in their own lives. So Facing History is another example, in addition to what I just shared with the AD, of a very organized way of starting to think about how to best address racial injustice at a systemic, or at least a large scale impact in our education world. So the sort of philosophical underpinning of a lot of the work of Facing History is that it's based around this very solid intellectual rigor of their material, study of history, but also to think about the ethics involved, think about the emotional engagement. You know, sometimes we sterilize our history to a point in teaching it that students no longer really connect with what happened. About providing more of those personal stories of people who are involved in the various episodes in our history so that students start to understand that and start to feel some of that themselves, and hopefully have more of a personal connection to it and feel more motivated to become active in some way to try to improve our system, that civic agency piece as well. So the last thing I'll say about history, facing history in ourselves, is that they do promote some really outstanding speakers, and there happens to be a speaker tomorrow night that they're hosting, and perhaps many of you know Helen Jia. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but she is well known particularly for her activism around the brutal murder of Vincent Chin many years ago, and has been a very strong activist ever since then. So she is speaking along with some others from Facing History tomorrow night. And there is registration information on the Facing History website if you're interested in that. So encourage you to check that out. So just to wrap up, and I do think I'm getting to the end of my time here, so I will wrap up. I just also encourage you to think about how to build alliances with other groups. Certainly that is happening in some other cities and perhaps more in Boston than I'm aware of. But this photo here happens to be from New York City. But sort of an alliance between a lot of the racial justice movement around Blacks right now and addressing the Asian American hate issues right now. In addition, there's also groups like the Anti-Defamation League that you're probably quite familiar with. They have a whole set of resources actually available for particularly to take note of this month, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, but are materials that could be used at any time to support that work. So there's certainly other organizations that have very similar concerns and support the work that you're doing. And I just hope that there's opportunities to build those kind of alliances across groups. And just as a last group, particularly in the Boston area, you're probably familiar with the program at UMass-Boston, the Asian American Studies program. Particularly active with Peter Keong there, who's been there many years and has done some outstanding work on racial issues, particularly affecting Asian Americans. And then the Viet Aid program at the Vietnamese Community Center in Dorchester, which again, you're probably quite familiar with, but I just thought I'd mention those as examples. I have put together a list of some resources that may be helpful in this work. This is just a sampling of some of that. And I can share some of that in the chat in just a moment, so you can you'll have access to that. Right? So I just want to thank you again for the opportunity to talk with all of you. I'd really be interested in having some discussion and certainly learning more about the work that you have underway right now.
Thank you so much, Dave, for your informative presentation. So we will talk about some details in the panel discussion later on. So let me welcome the next two speakers, and Dr. Anping Shen and Dr. Li Song Liu. Both of them have been spent a tremendous amount of effort to co-organize our series like roundtable symposiums, including today's symposium and the last week's symposium. So I want to personally and thank them very much for their time. All right, and let me introduce Dr. Anping Shen. Anping Shen has been a Newton School Committee member since 2017. He has been serving the Newton community for many years, including the Newton Chinese Language School principal and its founding board chair. He served on various Newton School councils and the Newton Public School Strategic Planning Team, Newton Human Rights Commission. He is also the founding president of Chinese American Association of Newton and the Newton Education Support Network. He holds Master in Education and a Doctor in Education from Boston University. Dr. Anping Shen, please.
And thank you so much. We appreciate that your great work with this forum and also the previous forums. It's my great pleasure to work with NECAA and all my colleagues here, friends. It's wonderful. And do you think I should share my slide or let someone help me? I'm a little bit nervous, but I could try to see if I can share my.
Yeah, I mean, give it a try. If it doesn't work, I can help.
Yeah, wonderful. I think we can see it, right?
Okay. Just give me 1 second and let me locate my. Okay, great. Okay, so you guys can see it?
Yes, wonderful.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Well, I recently read a Time magazine articles, and I thought that was wonderful resource. So I borrowed the title a little bit: History of Exclusion, of Erasure, and Invisibility. Where is Asian American story in our school curriculum? By the way, David, thank you so much for your presentation. If my presentation a little bit critical of kind of school curriculum, I hope you want to take any personal. So I understand your perspective and wonderful, a comprehensive perspective. My perspective is a little bit more focused and personal. So again, I apologize if there's any conflict of messages. But so here, I would like to emphasize again my message: speak up, speak out, act to change. I thought it was so critical at this moment. Where is our Asian American story in US classrooms? That was a question posed by this article publishing March 30th, 2021 Time issue, written by Olivia Waxman. And she asked the following question: history of exclusion, erasure, and invisibility, why the Asian American story is missing from many US classrooms. Well, there's a quote here. I feel like so many Asian elders have been targeted because of this stereotype that Asians are meek and quiet. And I apologize that there's a typo here. Should be quiet, not quiet. And don't speak up and don't say anything. And so it's important to be loud and to bring attention to this. Education is so important. If we don't know our history, then we are doomed to repeat the same thing over and over again. Is it so true that our Asian people have seen this cycle again? So if we don't tell the stories, other people will tell stories for us. And oftentimes those stories will not be nice, will not be beautiful. Sometimes could be ugly. And that's exactly happened in history in terms of Asian American community history here. And this picture has been classical, being used again. But I don't think we will have seen too many times. Let's just look at it one more time. And this is directly, I copied this from the website. The famous photograph taken on May 10th, 1869, commemorated the meeting of the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads at the Promontory Point, Utah, which marked the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Although most of the workers who constructed the Central Pacific Railway came from the West, from California, where Chinese, they were excluded from the original photograph of.
I'm Ping. Can you put the slides in presentation mode?
Okay.
Thank you.
I knew, let's see.
It's under view. Under view.
And the view, oh, okay. So this could be, okay. Let's cancel it.
Up at
so
the top
and the
of your
view.
Screen, view.
Yeah. And it should be slideshow.
Here you go.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul, to remind me. Okay. And let's. So, okay. Now, what happened? First, we didn't have the photo opportunity. That's fine. You know, many probably Chinese people did not like have a limelight, and even though probably we now appreciate it more. But you see, what happened later when the Chinese laborers were kicked around because, you know, many white laborers, let's put that way, thought that they were competing for the job opportunities. And so they were kicked around, they were killed, and so vandalism everywhere. And this word, hoodlum, is the word that came from the San Francisco area when those young people, gamblers, and they're stealing things and they got all the trouble. And then finally, they're just beating and killing. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, okay. And this is a horrible story. I hope people here all remember, and I hope I'm saying some right with two historians here. I have to be very careful what I'm saying here. But if I made a mistake, I apologize. And for Chinatown, it's not glorious origin of the Chinatown. It's basically those laborers had nowhere to go. They had to hang together and for their life. So that's why we had quite a few Chinatowns in those major areas. And San Francisco Chinatown happened to be probably the oldest Chinatown in the United States. And it's a shameful history, as a matter of fact, if we think about that. And it's so sad. Now, this is another famous picture of the in Second World War, when the Japanese were put into the internment camp, and because President signed executive order and considered they were potential enemies. And these were NECAA. These people were born in Japanese Americans born in this country, but they were considered as potential enemies. And look at that. They tried to show their loyalty to the national flag. And many Japanese young people joined the US Army and to fight in the Second World War. Why? Well, they want to, defend their own country, and they're also showing their fighting spirit and the loyalty to the US. And as a matter of fact, there's some famous story about those young people who are so brave, so courageous in the, especially in the European side of the Second World War, and they got the Congress Medal of Honor 50 years later. And it's very sad history, and we should all remember. And we did not hear any kind of German internment camp, right? Italian internment camp. Why this internment camp for Japanese? And there were 110,000 Japanese, probably more than that, were put into the camps. This is a story. I'm glad that David mentioned that story. And tomorrow there will be this famous activist and scholar, Helen Zier, right, will come to talk about this. And I hope people really remember this story, even though it's already pretty well known, but still, I don't think, David, do you think our middle school history book will mention this story, as far as you know?
I doubt it.
Okay. And this, it's not only the killing, by the way. This young man, as here, the explanation, he died almost age of 27, 8 days before his wedding. 8 days before his wedding, he had a bachelor party he's supposed to have the best time, this bachelor party. And then during the party, he was killed by 2 auto workers. They mistook him as Japanese worker. Regardless, Japanese or Chinese, he died a few days later. He died a few days later. And the mom was so sad, and she had to go back to China. She could not face the rat here. And these 2 killers paid $3,000, did not really spend time in a prison. And then the Chinese community leader said, this amounted to a 3,000 license to kill a Chinese American. 3,000 license. So you pay $3,000, you could kill Chinese American without any problem. And this case being viewed as critical turning point for Asian American civil rights engagement, and also for strong federal hate crime legislation. Now that's the meaning of this. And I hope that Vincent Chin was not killed in vain. And that's a legacy we should remember. This should be in a history book in the school's curriculum to remember this, because this covers so many areas. Now, I don't know how many people know this person, Grace Lee Boggs. I admit I did not know her until early this year when the Asian community leaders put out a statement, and I was included as one of the person to sign this. And she was the civil rights movement activist. She married to African American man, Mr. Boggs, and she died probably 10 years ago. And she became one of the most well-known civil rights movement leader, and someone considered her as a Marxist. Regardless, she had published books and made many speeches. And this quote I love so much. You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for, apologize, cannot read, for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. And I thought this is a wonderful quote. And I have to remind myself every day. Now, you can talk the talk, but where is walk the walk? And I'm going to be a little bit reflective, and we have to read this again and again to remind ourselves we have to engage. As David had mentioned, a lot of our movement, a lot of grassroots organization, and I think the Jewish people community set a very good example for us. So again, you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. And I sometimes I feel embarrassed when I talk to some people here. I said, are you American citizens? Because I'm collecting signature right now for my next 2 years school committee election. And some people being here, being citizen for more than 10 years, they have never gone to any election, cast any vote. And I feel a little bit puzzled and shamed. So my takeaway message, let me share with you a school story very quickly. And couple of weeks ago, I got the committee letter sent from a couple of Korean Americans. And in the letter, the mom said her daughter, 4th grade daughter, was in the as a distant learning student, was bullied by a classmate, a white boy, constantly. The boy always called the girl's incorrect name. And he knew when he used this name, the girl would be, upset. And the girl asked this boy to stop. The boy kept using name. And finally, the girl just did not engage this boy. Okay, then when the school reopened, they went back to school, and the boy saw the girl again in school, and he used same tricks, but girl did not engage. Finally, the boys used the word CHINK. That was just like the N word for African American people. That word really, really made the girl's parents so furious. And the mom told me, said, this boy messed up with the wrong parents. So basically they sent letters to everybody. And I saw a letter. I was first one jump out. I said, we should do something. We should see some action. And I talked to 2 school committee members, both of them African-American school committee members. They followed me very quickly, and they wrote the letters publicly to school committee members, to city councilors, and one of the African-American school committee member, she happened to be the vice chair last term. She called the superintendent and had private conversation because she had also was involved in some other issues, regarding the African-American students. So she had more experience. I was so grateful. I was so grateful. Now imagine if I was the only person on school committee to speak. Do you think superintendent would listen? Do you think other people would listen? Think about it. 9 school committee members. But with these 2 African-American school committee members speak, my voice amplified multiple times. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Our voice is not strong enough. So, and I pushed. I could share with you. One Newton school leader sent me email saying, Anping, I thought you are a very thoughtful person. You asked thoughtful question. Her underlying statement was, why this time you are so emotional? She did not say that, but we can all read why you are not thoughtful this time. Boy, imagine one of school leaders, even under the superintendent, will send me this message. Imagine that. And I responded right away. I said, use the language, speak up, speak out. This is time for us to speak up and speak out. And we acted for change. We want to see changes. And finally, I responded quite a few times publicly. And finally, a school principal and talked to the Forge, which is a family organizing for racial justice, to have a forum for school committee. And I made a speech again, thanked the parents. And I also talked to the parents. I said, let's work together. Let's raise the level of this story. Not only talking about just to get some action to this boy, but we want to raise this to the high ground. And the mom asked the girl to start upstanders club at the elementary school. I felt so empowered of this action. I'm so happy. And by the way, I got the parents who contacted me from Lexington because something going on there. The parent heard my action, so they asked me for advice. So those things are still going on. So again, my takeaway message is this is right time to speak up, speak out, speak as advocate. Now that's important. When we are in a position to speak out, we have to be a powerful advocate and speak with allies. That's exact what happened when I had a chance to have two allies from my school committee. And the final is act to change. We have to act to change. I know David reminded us it's not easy if we're thinking about anything about school curriculum. Yes, but remember, it takes longer time. I just read that for African American to have their museum in DC, it took them 100 years. 100 years. Okay, there has to be a beginning. And I heard that a lot of Asian people are thinking about to establish the Asian American Museum in DC. And of course, that's national level. At state level, I'm so happy we're doing something right now. We have to do something. And again, we have to own our stories. Again, David mentioned that stories. Yes, if we do not own our stories, the narrative will be ugly. And we have seen that again, and again. If we do not own our stories, other people will tell stories for us. And sometimes could it be distorted, misleading, or utterly incorrect. So we have to own our stories. We have to own our narratives. Can we say we have to own our history? And this is time to start doing something. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anping, for your great presentation. So it is a long journey to fulfill our goal, but we're glad that we have started here right now. Let's welcome our next. And Dr. Liu is a professor of history at Massachusetts College of Art and Design and an associate in research at Harvard Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. He teaches Asian American history, East Asian history, world history, and US-China relations. His current research focuses on Chinese American history in the greater Boston area. Professor Liu, please.
Thank you, Ben, for the kind introduction, and thank you for organizing this symposium. And it's just wonderful. Thank you, Anping, for sharing such inspirational stories. I was so moved. You're exactly right. I think we need to not just be visible in our textbook, at the same time, we need to be visible in our own community, in our daily life. They go together. And thank you, Dave, for your wonderful insights about the school curriculum design at the state level. I'm so honored to be at the same panel with two of you, so distinguished experts, education experts, and community leaders. So for my talk, let me share my screen here. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. I will start with this one. So my talk will start with my experience of teaching Asian American history at UMass-Boston, and then focus on two questions. Why is it important to restore the rightful place of AAPI history in American history and in history education? And what might be the challenges and opportunities? So depending on time, I may not be able to talk about the challenges and opportunities, but I think we can discuss that in our Q&A session. So I have taught Asian American history several times. The first time I taught it at UMass-Boston was 4 years ago. It was one of my most memorable and meaningful classes. So you see in a cartoon, one of my students, Jill, in the end of the class. We dived into an experience of Asian Americans right away in the beginning. And we constantly reflected on what the class meant to us. My students said that before the class, they had rarely seen themselves in textbooks and the class discussions. And in that class, they could, and they felt safe in the classroom. I always remember the word they used to express their feelings, safe. Safe in the sense that they no longer felt marginalized and ignored in history books. Also, safe in the sense that they could reclaim their root, their identity, their culture, and lend support to each other. That is the need and the power of studying Asian American Pacific Islander history for our young generations at both the college and the K-12 levels. Now I will elaborate a little more on why studying the AAPI history is important. First, let me introduce to you this well-known book that is about why history education in American schools has been problematic. You might have heard of this book by Professor James Loewen. Lies my teacher told me, everything your American history textbooks got wrong. Professor Loewen started his full-time teaching at a black college in Mississippi in the late 1960s. In a class, he asked his students what they knew about the Reconstruction after the Civil War. And he was astonished by students' answers. The blacks took over the southern states, but they were freed not long ago, so they didn't know how to govern. And the whites had to take the control again. So that's the answer from the students. That was the narrative they had learned from school and the media. And it was even more ironic to hear this narrative from the black students who had internalized these narratives promoted by the southern states after the Civil War, with the stereotypes of the blacks being inferior and incapable of democratic government, and the whites being natural rulers. So after that class, Professor Loewen decided to write his own history textbook. And later, he conducted a systematic survey of popular history textbooks in American schools and published its findings in the best-selling book in 1995 titled Lies My Teacher Told Me. It sold 2 million copies, this book. Professor Loewen's finding is eye-opening. American students have been taught a very watered down and inaccurate history at schools, which is civically misleading, intellectually crippling, and practically boring for the students. Just a few examples. Helen Keller is a household name for young American students, an inspiring role model who overcame extreme physical and mental challenges. But most textbook accounts of Keller are mainly about her early years while glossing over her adult life, including her tireless work for social equality and her devotion to the socialist cause. As Keller later realized that while she herself could gain education and recognition, people born into certain social classes often faced insurmountable difficulties in changing their fate. However, textbooks won't really include Keller's questioning of the class inequality in the United States, as well as her devotion to socialism, as it would run against the dominant narratives in this country. This is a nation with equal and endless opportunities for everyone, and this is a capitalist society incompatible with socialism. As a result, what we know about Keller is not a complete or accurate picture, and we lose the opportunity of understanding her rich life and the real struggles of American society. So that's just one example Professor Loewen used in his book. Similarly, Columbus has long been portrayed as a great explorer, but what he did terribly to Native Americans after the so-called discovery of the New World often would not be highlighted in textbooks at all, as the image of this first hero of America and this pioneering and civilized European needs to be maintained. Similarly, the founding fathers, their owning slaves and the Lincoln's problematic perceptions of the Black people would often be glossed over, as the United States needs these perfect and glorified leaders rather than real and fallible human beings to prove the nation's manifest destiny. It is the same reason, basically, why the AAPI history has been marginalized and silenced. as the experiences of Asian American Pacific Islanders often won't fit that master narrative of the United States as the land of the free and home of the brave, that everyone wants to come and everyone can achieve the American dream. Now I will focus on the question, why is AAPI history important for our students? In fact, when we talk about including AAPI history in school curriculum, it is not just about adding some AAPI related content to school education. Quite often that is superficial, and the added content would be just supplementary without really challenging the master narratives, similar to world history textbooks that often added some pages of non-Western cultures without really challenging the Western-centric framework that prioritizes Western experience and embrace explicitly or implicitly Western superiority. When we talk about restoring the rightful place of AAPI history in American history and in K-12 education, we are talking about the central role AAPI history has played in defining America as a nation. So I will use a few examples here I'm familiar with as an Asian Americanist to show why AAPI history is important. First, the China trade. The China trade played a critical role in the revolutionary era for the United States to both gain wealth and claim its independence from Britain, as the trade at that time was largely monopolized by the British, and an independent trade with China would represent the American independence on a world stage. In this context, we can understand why on February 22nd, 1784, which was George Washington's birthday, the first US trading vessel set sail for China at the same harbor when another ship also sailed for London to deliver the peace treaty between the US and Great Britain. To make it more complicated, but also more relevant to our Boston area, the China trade, unfortunately, particularly the notorious opium trade, had contributed significantly to the rise of wealthy Bostonians in the 19th century, whose money helped establish many important cultural and social institutions in Boston. Today, when we go to the magnificent libraries, museums, hospitals, are we aware of this important connection between Asia and America? This will be important local and national history with Asia and the Asian Americans in the center for our young students to explore. A second example I would like to share, showing the central role of Asian Americans in American history, is the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This act might be one of the few things history textbooks would mention regarding Asian American experience. But people often do not know that the law not just affected Chinese immigrants, but played a central role in defining the whole American immigration system, in regulating the lives of all immigrants. Nobody would live the same way with the advent of the Chinese Exclusion Act. As the first federal law barring a racial and national group from entering the United States, the Exclusion Act set the precedent and the mechanisms for the United States to restrict and exclude other groups in the future. When the Exclusion Act was renewed in 1892, the Gary Act added the requirement that all Chinese residents carry permits, a precursor of the green card in our modern era. Faced with this draconian law, Chinese immigrants filed more than 7,000 cases in the first decade after the passage of the Exclusion Act, often with success, largely in response to the numerous cases filed by Chinese immigrants. The 1891 Immigration Act set up the Office of the Superintendent of Immigration, The next year, the Ellis Island immigration station was opened. The power of the federal government in regulating immigration continued to grow, and its immigration and the consular offices over time would often exercise that power beyond judicial review. That mattered to every American, right? A third example of the central role of Asian Americans in American history is an important legal case in 1898. Wang King Ark was born in San Francisco in 1873. In 1894, he visited China and then returned with all the required documents for re-entry. However, his citizenship was questioned. The Supreme Court eventually ruled in his favor in 1898, affirming the birthright citizenship granted in the 14th Amendment. There's no need to explain how important this reaffirmation of the 14th Amendment and the birthright citizenship is. It affects all Americans, regardless of their race or nationality. And Wang King Ark has been dubbed father of birthright citizenship. In a word, Chinese and Asian immigration has not just led to specific laws targeting Chinese and Asian immigrants. These immigrants have helped shape American immigration system as a whole and has defined the American national identity and the meanings of American citizenship. Our education of AAPI history in K-12 curriculum needs to go beyond a few well-known and generalized topics, and it needs to show the richness of the Asian American experience and the central role Asian Americans have played in the history of this nation. So I will just spend maybe a few minutes. I know it's already 8:50. So I just want to briefly touch upon the challenges we would have in restoring the rightful place of AAPI history in K-12 curriculum. First of all, the challenge would come from the persisting master narrative, a narrative well entrenched in popular culture, in public understanding, and in school textbooks. But we also need to be careful about the resistance among ourselves because of our misunderstanding of the past or miscommunication with each other. I would like to focus on the modern minority myth, particularly here, which was created after the Second World War and remaining popular and influential now. It goes like this. Asian Americans are modern minorities compared to other groups. Other racial minorities, or even the whites, they often have better educational achievements, have a better socioeconomic status, are disciplined, family-oriented, and self-reliant. In a word, they are well-behaved, and they have achieved the American dream. Well, this seems to be a good image or positive stereotype. Some of my fellow Chinese migrant friends might also say that this is the leftist academics. It is the leftist academics who see this as a problem. But if you look into history and understand the genesis of this image, you will become more concerned about its real intention and its serious impacts. Let me pose this question first. We have become familiar with the centuries-old racial and cultural stereotypes of Asians as Orientals and the yellow peril, and they were excluded from American citizenship up to the 1940s and 1950s. Here is the left image is the famous painting commissioned by the German emperor in the late 19th century, portraying the East as the malicious yellow peril threatening the Western civilization. Then, how come suddenly Asian Americans would become welcomed and accepted as exemplary immigrants, even better than whites? What happened? The answer is the Cold War and the need of the American government and the media to use these once foreign communities to show that they were not racially targeted as propagated by the communist camp, and that these Asian communities could in fact do well in a liberal capitalist America as the proof of the superiority of the American system. Again, that's the master narrative, isn't it? And for some Chinese and Japanese immigrants at this time, This newly constructed image, model minority, might seem appealing and elevating, especially for some Japanese Americans who suffered the trauma of internment and wanted to embrace an image proving their assimilability and respectability. However, in endorsing this model minority myth, they also helped consciously or unconsciously promote the more vicious aspect of this model minority myth, which was to delegitimize the demands of other racial minorities, especially the Black Americans, who at this time had staged numerous protests for civil rights and had been viewed by the American government and the media as radical and violent. Besides serving American ideological interests in the Cold War and poisoning Asian Americans' relations with other racial minorities, the model minority myth also puts pressure on Asian American youth, as they are expected to behave well and excel in academics. Accordingly, the stereotype of Asian Americans as talented in math and science, but deficient in personality and leadership. It also dismisses the glaring poverty within the community, such as the refugee population from Southeast Asia and the working class and undocumented migrants in each national group, and their need for government support. The image of Asian Americans as being successful, self-reliant, and submissive has naturally contributed to the lack of public attention to Asian Americans, including their absence in history textbooks and classroom discussions. The challenges can also be opportunities, however, and I look forward to the Q&A session when we can talk about more about these challenges and opportunities. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for Professor Lee Song Liu for wonderful presentation, and a lot of real stories happened in the United States, and we never knew. I personally never knew previously, and we should know that. I know that from day one. So let's start our panel discussion, and so all the audience are welcome to type your question, post your question in the Q&A box, and I want to start with a question I just have received actually that matches our main topic of today. Ms. Lui has asked great questions. She said, she asked, if textbook framework is not likely to be changed anytime sooner per David, how can we effectively tell or push out our own story in classrooms bearing any legislation changes? Well, I would like to ask all the panelists to talk about how we as Asian American community to reach out to public schools, to reach out curriculum design teams, if we cannot change the curriculum framework soon, so maybe we can make some change on the supplemental documents or the resources for teachers, as David mentioned. So how can we reach that goal? So who would like to start first? Dr.
I can start. Quickly, I understand the curriculum is very difficult to revise within short time, and politically, it's a very huge task. But we have lots of things to do. One thing I like to emphasize, and I hope that David agree, American education is localized business, and so district has a lot of leeway to to decide the curriculums. And one thing to do that, I think we would work with the school teachers, and hopefully they would hire more Asian teachers. For example, in Newton, at Newton North High School, there happen to be 2 Asian American teachers. They've been very actively provide workshop seminars to their colleagues. And my daughter and my son went through their classes. One of them taught the Asian American literature, and wonderful class. So my daughter learned a lot of things from that class. And also, we should get involved in the community, policymaking process. I understand Lexington, and you have a very powerful, well-connected organization to push for more, policies regarding, say, diversified teaching staff. I've been doing that myself. Last round of superintendent evaluation, I put the evaluation, the focus on my evaluation is to emphasize we need to diversify the teaching faculty and the leadership in Newton schools. And I talked to school committee chair, make sure my evaluation will be included. And unfortunately, she did not include the first time. I pushed hard and talked to the other allies and then was included. And recently, Newton North High School's new principal happened to be an Indian American teacher. She has the STEM background. And I tend to think this is not coincidence. But we as parents should work together, get involved, PDO meeting, organize some, PDO activities, more kind of get involved and show our interest in schoolwork. So even give some a free, a presentation to the classroom activities. If teacher asks you, say, hey, Lunar New Year is coming. Would you like to speak about, Lunar New Year culture and all the things like that? And can also talking about other topics. Let me stop here. So I like to hear other people's input.
Dave, you want to go next?
Okay, Lizong, if that's fine. I'd like to, and presentation, that was really, really informative and a good reminder about the opium trade and many other pieces of that and the effect. So thank you very much for that. So building on what Anping was just saying, I think he's quite correct that districts do have a good deal of flexibility in how they interpret the standards and the framework. Framework is kind of a building code for history curriculum, and that doesn't dictate the architecture. So teachers do have some leeway in how they design the curriculum that teaches those standards. So in addition to that, the fact that districts do have that kind of flexibility, I would just add also that it is important to be focused on the kind of professional development and that there's actually funding for any professional development for history and social studies teachers, because there's very little funding available for that right now. So to advocate for that in districts and perhaps some of your work at the state level, I think that's an important lever to activate as well about all of this. In addition, I think it's important to emphasize that in the 2018 framework, there's a really new orientation in that framework around much deeper use and more frequent use of primary source documents. And that is really done on purpose as a motivator for teachers to integrate multiple perspectives into how they're teaching the content. So that we're getting away actually from use of textbooks so much, less reliance on textbooks. Textbooks are not the curriculum, or it should not be. And the use of these primary source documents is a way to provide an opportunity for students to get multiple perspectives on the events of history. And as Lizong was explaining in some of his examples there. So I'll stop there, but I think those are a couple of main points around how to have impact in the actual classroom.
That's great. Thank you for all the insights. I think you are more experienced with the school structure and the curriculum. I'm not that familiar with that, but I would agree with what Anping said. I think as parents, we can participate actively in a PTO organization. Get engaged, go to the classrooms. I remember once I was invited by my daughter's teacher in the 4th grade to talk about the Chinese festival. And in that class, 1 or 2 recent Chinese immigrant kid was in the class. Obviously, he was still having a very difficult time to acculturate to the new environment. So with me there, speaking in Chinese, talking about the Chinese festival, I think made quite a difference in the classroom, at least at that moment for the kid. So I would really encourage all the parents, Chinese American parents or Asian American parents to fully get engaged in the PTO events. I think that's the best we can do as parents.
Thank you very much. And a follow-up question from Ms. Loying. And can school actually accept supplementary materials complied by API other than school teachers? Say if some volunteers comply useful materials? So who would like to, I think, please.
I can take a
Sure.
a first response on that. It is possible for teachers to accept that material. I think the way to have the most impact actually though is to think about how to make additional materials, some of which I was suggesting in what I talked about earlier, through the state. So there is that supplemental document that supports the framework and is there for any teachers to access, and has a relatively high profile on the state website. So I think that's one way to really try to integrate some of these additional materials that would support the content that we're talking about tonight in that document particularly. But it's certainly, there are other opportunities to make other materials available to teachers. So I'll hold it there and leave it, turn it over to Anping here.
Very quickly, David, I'm glad you mentioned it during your presentation about the organization Facing History and Ourselves. And that organization has been very influential and well-connected, well-founded, I believe. Started probably by a group of Jewish community, I believe. And they started talking about the Holocaust, but expanded it to the, discrimination and, minority and all other issues. So, and then they provide a lot of materials and workshops, seminars for teachers. And I think this could be one of the models for our AAPI community. We could, organize some workshops. For example, in the summer, teachers love to attend some workshops and work even with Department of Education. I'm not quite sure what's the process here, but that's important. I'm very glad to hear this organization and anti-defamation organization, another organization, but Facing History and Ourselves, I believe located in Brookline, right? I don't know if now. So we need to contact. I would strongly, suggest NECAA probably even can visit the headquarters and talk to people there to see their model, and that should be one. And also the primary source in Watertown, which is another well-known organization. I served as board member a few years back, and one of staff happened to be David, working at Department of Education as the coordinator of history and social study testing coordinator. She came from primary source. So let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Great answers. So another two questions from two principals from Chinese schools. Li Jia is the principal from Brookline Chinese School. She asked, as we all know that AAPI is not only about the Chinese, how to you united with other ethnic groups like Japanese, Korean, Indian, Vietnamese to bring the Asian American voices in school history curriculum confirmation? And the second question, I think is related from the vice principal of Newton Chinese Language School, Nai Zhongqiu. So we have Chinese schools in many communities. How do panelists see the language school can help with?
Well, I think if I can address the first question first. There is a recent new organization just founded, the Asian American Foundation, TAAF, T-A-A-F, and it has collected unprecedented amount of donations recently. And I watched the ceremony when they launched the organization a few weeks ago. And Jose, one of the main Asian American speakers on the panel, was saying, yes, we do have differences. Our different Asian American national groups often would carry their cultural national heritage and also even some negative relationships back in their homeland. For example, in the Sino-Japanese War or the Southeast Asian wars. But after learning about the differences, the main purpose here in the United States is to unite with each other because we have the very common mission to defend our rights, to claim our voice, to assert our history in the school educational curriculum. So I don't think the differences will be a hurdle. I think the differences can, in fact, help all the different national groups to understand where they came from. And then they can also study how Asian American as a concept started in the 1960s as a tool, a political term to unite all the Asian American groups for more collective strength, for more representation in the public. So I would say the differences are natural, and it doesn't really prevent Asian American groups to understanding their unit, their common cause, and to pursue the common interest.
So any comments from MP?
Yeah. As someone who served on the school principal and board chair for quite a few years, I think Chinese language school as heritage language school has a big role in community. And I'm so glad for past few years, we get involved in the community, helping, sponsor the culture festival and the election campaign forum to invite the candidates and listen to their perspective, and also working with other Chinese heritage language schools. That's very important. I think Li Song mentioned that we and David mentioned too, we have to work with together. Asian American, API, is very broad, multiple, groups. So sometimes we think a little bit too focused. We forget the Chinese Americans, even though counting for probably majority, if I'm right, but still there are so many groups. We have to think about their groups, and sometimes their struggle even harder. Considering the past 10 years, the mainland families have more and more wealth now compared with other Southeast Asian Americans. So we have to think about that. And I think at last forum, Professor Paul Watanabe mentioned that the desegregated the Asian data issue, and he did not elaborate. But that's something we have to be very critical ourselves. How much we need to help them. We need allies. Keep in mind why so many Jewish people are liberals, progressive. There's a reason, historical reason, political reason. Why? Even though many of them are quite well-to-do, like Newton. But we had an example, several years ago, when a group of Jewish families who were very conservative, they did not like school curriculum because the teachers taught about, Israeli armies kill some Arab people. They were so upset. But the majority Jewish community here, the leaders here, support the school. Now that's a very powerful message. I was on school committee. I was impressed. The vice school committee chair wrote an open letter to his fellow Jewish people saying, this is America. We need to respect democracy and the truth. And he got a lot of hate mails and even some very horrible phone calls to his home. He had to ask police to protect him and his family. When I saw that letter, I wrote a personal letter to him to tell him, I really admire your courage. And if I were in your situation, I did not say that, but I thought if I were in his situation, I don't know if I have courage to tell my fellow people, shut up. This is America. You have to respect democracy. You need to, help the other people and do not think you are above other minority. That's not the case. I could get a little bit emotional, but let me stop here, please.
Thank you, MP. Any comments, David?
Ben, yeah, if I could, please. I'll just mention that I just included a list of resources that I put together recently that could be helpful. I included a link to that in the chat. Anybody attending this is welcome to use that, and happy to get your comments on that if you have additions to suggest on that as well. But I think it's a good starting point with more to go, I'm sure. I'll also note here that Angela Lee, who's attending tonight, who's quite a well-known and respected history teacher in her own right, and also served on the revision of the framework panel, as a matter of fact. She was just noticing that there's a lot of material available through Facing History, particularly focused on the Asian American and Pacific Islander experience. I was just looking at that today. So there is a host of material there, and would encourage anybody to take a look at that. So to the original question here, and I hope I'm answering it, I think the big challenge in this content area is that there's so much content to teach that teachers can easily be overwhelmed with the volume of what has to be taught. So the Educating for American Democracy roadmap that I was talking about is a response to that challenge, because we're recognizing that teachers sometimes just don't teach the necessary content because they're so overwhelmed with it. So that's one way to start to provide some priorities and identify what is really important to teach in the history content area, particularly in American history in this case. So that's one guidance I think that can be useful for teachers and all of us as we advocate for improved teaching about this content.
Thank you so much. And so for the next couple of minutes, let me just extend this symposium for a little bit more longer. So I would like to ask, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand. You can feel free to open the floor to allow you to ask directly to the panelists.
Hi, Ben, can I ask a question?
Sure, please.
First,
go ahead.
Thank you all. Thank you to David, Professor Liu, and Professor Sen for the inspiring, informative webinar. I learned a lot. Yes, we're all inspired or tried to make some change at the grassroots, but I think sometimes because we're not in the circles, we feel like we're like powerless. This is a general question. I know the U.S. public school is a humongous system. Maybe David can shed some light. How the U.S. developed the curriculum, how the curriculum get updated, or how often does it at all, regarding the social study, history, etc., for the elementary and middle school. I mean, I think that's where we need to find a wedge to start.
So that's a big question. The process differs from state to state, but here in Massachusetts, generally there is a cycle of revisions for each of the frameworks, math, science, and so forth, all the content areas, and that happens on different frequencies. I think I mentioned earlier that it's happened very infrequently for history and social studies, and I think is really an indication of the lack of attention to this content area for a long time. And we're probably seeing some of the results of that in our society these days. But the process is a complicated one because obviously in this content area, there's a lot of people with strong opinions and a lot to in making sure that their content is included in the framework. So again, the challenge is really keeping any framework organized in a way that's useful for teachers and doesn't have so much in it that it's just overwhelming. So I would say that the framework in Massachusetts, the last time it was revised was in 2003, and then the current framework that we have came through in 2018. So that's a long span of years. Hopefully there will be more frequent revisions. And the determination of the content in that is really done through what I described earlier about the public input through surveys, through written documentation to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and through input of the history panel that I referred to, the group of educators that advise on that process. But as I said, a lot people have pretty strong interests and pretty strong opinions about what history should be taught and what should not be taught. So it is it's one of the third rail issues in our world right now is deciding on what that content will be and how it will be organized and how it will be presented for teachers to teach.
Thank you.
Let me just quickly jump in. David, I know looking at the list of the people who involved in that history and social study curriculum, there could be probably close to 100 people, right? But if you look at closely to see how many Asians, of course, we have to guess. You know, certain people, many people can guess from last name, but sometimes you cannot guess if you know, married, right? Change last name. But I would not be surprised the percent of people who were involved, probably majority of them white. And a minority could be less, but Asian people could even lesser than other minorities. That's the fact. In Newton, again, you know, we have about 20% of students, but Newton educators and leadership, probably 2 or 3%. And they're very unfortunate. I happen to see 2 wonderful teachers, but that's far in between. So again, we have to get involved, and hopefully the grassroots kind of ground swelling and then move up. And, you know, more and more people involved, intellectuals, scholars, teachers. And I often emphasize, you know, education is a wonderful field. I talk to parents, you know, encourage your kids to be teachers. But that's, you see, a long way to go, but that's important. And if even as citizens, we are not get involved, that's very sad fact here. And you cannot count on other people to help you. You have to get involved to be responsible, as the Grace Boggs, you know, the quotation. So let's start from us. It's not easy and takes time, but we have to get more involved. And that's talking about civic engagement.
Thank you.
Right.
Actually, that's right. We have no representation, just like in American democracy. We have no representation, you know, no voice.
Yeah.
Right. I just want to add one point here. We may have particular challenges in this area. One, we don't have enough big population here. So nationwide, the Asian American, Chinese American population only about 5%. And the majority would be living on the West Coast. So the population here in the Northeast, in New England, is very, very limited. So we don't have much power based on that limited population size. Secondly, the New England, Massachusetts particularly, has this traditional identity as the beacon on the hill. It's very deeply embedded. Then that's the first colonists. That's the core American, the formation of the American nation in the beginning. So it would stick to its original identity. That's why we don't see many Asian American studies programs here, unfortunately. Unlike the Midwestern states or Western states in California, Washington, Oregon, or even the Midwestern states where I came from, Minnesota. So the Asian American studies programs are booming, they're flourishing for many years, but we don't have many Asian American studies here in Boston area, which is very ironic. So I think I totally agree with what Anpin said and Dave said. We really need to mobilize the community to get involved, to build the bridges between scholars, between experts in different fields, and the schools. Grassroots movement is very important in this area, I would say.
Yeah, just to add to that, I would just encourage you to take some inspiration from the work that you already have done, and that the fact that your group has come together as it has already and done so much, just being organized as an organization and not coming at this individually has a lot of power to it. I've seen that in the arts and folks organizing to advocate for arts education. I've seen that in the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition as a group that's come together to advocate with one voice about civic education. And I think all of you have that already starting in this group as well. So I just encourage you to take some heart from that.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. I saw Miss Mona Rowe has a very good answer typed in the chat. Mona, would you like to say it in person? Mona?
Oh, yeah, I'm not even sure which answer. I just, about our history, about our history. I wasn't sure what you're referring to.
I say you think language and culture schools are important.
Yes, I
yeah.
do. Yes, so that is true. The cultural schools, someone referred to this as one of the struggles. I think we've done a good job over the years of building infrastructure in different Asian communities of having the language schools, which then become more like cultural schools where we teach about the culture. And part of why we do that is because our own public schools just have no representation and our kids just don't get the windows and mirrors that are needed in public school. So we do that. And what happens is our kids, so if you're Bengali, you're learning about Bengali history. If you're, if you're Chinese, you're learning about Chinese history. But what's happening is that we're not really communicating that out to others. And the other truth is, I think we have to be realistic, is there's a diversity within resources within immigrant populations. And I think, and I don't just mean money, but I mean sort of bandwidth. If you're busy, if there's a household where both parents are working, and then on the weekend they're taking their kids to, Hindi school, Bengali school, Chinese school, Korean school, I think sometimes it's hard to get parents to really understand how they then find the energy to turn around and go to the school committee meeting and advocate for these things. So I think one thing that we're trying to do in Lexington a little bit is make it a little bit easier to kind of access these things. But I'm hoping that, these language cultural schools are often, regional. So I think that's a place where, I will call myself out. I was a teacher there and I did not really do an adequate job, of encouraging parents to be more engaged in advocating for AAPI education, education regarding AAPI history. And that's a shame because we've been part of this. AAPI have built this country along with everybody else. So I think that is something that I hope others who have more power at these schools will do.
Thank you so much, Mona. And if you are already in the panel, you can always feel free to jump in to add your comments. And Angela Lee, if you have any comments, just feel free to jump in anytime. All right, next, I see Helen Lee has raised hand. Helen, you can talk.
Probably Helen is mute.
Yeah, probably. So Helen has asked 2 questions in the Q&A. So, all right. So while we are waiting for the time Helen is getting online, so I want to answer Suzanne Wang's previous question, asking how we as a MA resident could do to help to pass a bill. So I think as a MA resident, you can contact your district state representative, ask he or she to either endorse or co-sign the bill H 584 and the S 365. So in that way, so the bill can pass both House and the Senate. So eventually can go through until the governor to sign it. All right, Helen, you can talk, Helen Lee. Okay, we are approaching to the end of the symposium, and I would like to use my privilege as a moderator. I would like to ask all the 3 panelists to prepare 1 or 2 sentences, and as well as 2 co-chair from the New England Chinese American Alliance, Chen and Wang Hua, to prepare 1 or 2 sentences. We come back together as our closing remark. Any questions from our audience?
Helen typed in saying she might be asking questions, but we couldn't hear her.
Yeah. Right.
Oh.
Okay, so I can read her question actually. So Helen Lee has asked, any tips in early learning community, including elementary school age kids, parents, and families? Parents and teachers trainings are keys too. Families engagement initiatives, and so on.
Not quite sure if talking about general early learning or cultural learning, you know, or the community building learning. Let me just throw out my final message. We really have to get involved. And being on the school committee, I realize while I'm talking to many people, but sometimes to mobilize is always a huge effort. So please think about this, not only doing something for community, especially if you come to this community, come to this country, you want to do something. And this is the time. And you would not disappointed that years later when you can no longer get involved and you feel, okay, I came to this country, I was helped by community, but I did my share. And that's very, very important. And your kids are watching. Your kids are watching. And you might get enjoyment, your kids might get enjoyment. And I know my both kids are doing fine. They realize their Asian, you know, identity. But they're also involved in the mainstream community. So that's my final message. Thanks.
That's wonderful, Anping. Thank you. If I may, in fact, I want to address the questions Ben you just asked on behalf of the audience. I think it's also related to the question about the age. I remember earlier, maybe Lin asked the question about whether it's appropriate to tell our young kids very heavy, tragic experiences of Asian Americans. I think that goes back to what David said earlier. We don't just talk about those tragic, violent experience, the dark experience. We also talk about the success. We also talk about the brilliance, the agency of Asian Americans. So maybe for the younger age, we can tell them, in fact, a full picture of what happened, but at the same time, be more encouraging, be more inspiring. But when they grow older, we can change our format. I think in schools or in our families. I always remember one of the best American historians, Joyce Appleby, a past president of American Historical Association. She had an interview and she said she was so frustrated with American schools, always with the same content. So students always feel bored by all the historical facts, the same facts over and over again. She was saying, why not give the kids, young kids, some inspirational stories so that they have role models when they are young, including their own cultural heroes. Then when they grow older, encourage them to go to the local community, to study local history, to be more specific. And then when they grow even older in the high school, they can learn about civics. They can learn the American political system, legal system. So these different levels of education can be very strategic, can be more effective than the boring history classes usually in schools. And so I think my concluding remark would be, I think history, as a historian, naturally I would believe, understanding our heritage is super important to cultivate our self-confidence, to know where we come from. But we also don't want to limit ourselves in our own groups. As one of our audiences members said earlier, how to not just talk about our own history, but other people's history. Because by understanding our history as well as other people's history, we will see the common humanity. And then we can really better understand ourselves. We can see the common cause. We can unite. And we can have a much more stronger voice together. And then we can become global citizens rather than just limited in our own cultural group or national group.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Please. For that, thank you for your message on that. That's something I think that gets lost quite often in these discussions as we get off into focusing on our particular interest in it. And I think it's the end goal really is about that common humanity. So thank you for raising that point. I just say it in closing that, again, I think it's really important that we teach the the stories of the past and both those of that are difficult to tell, but also the successes. But I really think we need to think about beyond the stories, that we're also helping students to build the skills they need to understand others' perspectives. And I think we can sometimes get bound up and tied up in wanting to tell one group or another's point of view, and we end up turning it into this face-off between different racial groups or whatever groups we might be talking about. When in fact, I think we all have this common interest in coming to some common understanding of each other, even if we can't accept every other person's perspective. So I do hope we can promote that perspective, some of that, the SEL understanding that I was talking about earlier, and some of this idea of a common humanity. I'd also just like to reemphasize the idea of building on the current organization that you have in place, and it's really impressive what you have already. It's clearly done a lot during the pandemic, and I think has great potential for moving forward on some of the issues we've been talking about tonight. So I would again encourage alliances with other groups that are facing similar struggles, because I think there's a lot of commonality that we don't always build on. We tend to sometimes stay too isolated in our advocacy. And then last but not least, I think it's really important to think about what you can do legislatively and taking the advocacy to our elected officials. And as I said earlier, I think it's super important to act with one voice and to come to that as one organization, because I think legislators particularly respond to having a particular champion for the message that you're trying to get across. So I hope you can build on that. And again, I really appreciate being part of the discussion tonight, and look forward to hearing more about your work in the future.
Thank you so much, David. Let me jump in for the last question. So this is the last question before we end. So the vice principal from the Newton Chinese Language School has asked, I'm wondering how much investment really went in studying AAPI history in the US. I'm thinking government should fund such studies so that we can have rich material to feed into K-12. So any comments?
Well,
I think this is the answer, right? There's not such a study to.
My instinct is that it's kind of different culture thinking. In this country, you cannot count on the federal government or even state government to give you guides. You have to work, yourself and try to get involved and raise your voice. And for AAPI, that's particularly the case. And probably, Asian people being too quiet, as we said, and too meek and did not raise voice and learn terrible lesson. So this is the first time, I think, since I came to this country 30 some years ago, and a strong ground swelling movement now. So this is the moment we have to seize it. But again, I listened to David and to Lee Song, and we have to work with the other groups and hopefully have kind of a strong unified voice, work as advocate, but also work with allies. That's important. And otherwise, 5-6% of Asian people will not go anywhere without that kind of, strong support from our community.
That's right. I know based on Professor Paul Watalabe's talk, or maybe his conversation earlier, the Asian American Studies program at the UMass-Boston this year seemed to have got funding, which is great because the federal funding for Asian American Studies or ethnic studies programs is always precarious. So it's great they have got funding for the following years. And for me personally, maybe because of this year's environment, I applied for my university's faculty research grant and I got it. So I think there are good signs that as long as we try very hard, voice out, speak out, as Anping said. We will get our share. We will get our equal share. We should do more. We can do more.
Yes, definitely. We have a good momentum here with the Illinois state just the bill to teach AAPI history in K-12. And also I have heard that the Congresswoman Grace Mann has proposed a bill to teach AAPI history in education in the second time. This time she will get more supporter and co-signer. I think it's a great momentum for us to like be united together to avoid whatever I will say, right? This is a good momentum. Any comments, Debbie? Okay, so now let's move to the last portion. That's the part is the closing remarks. I would like to ask all of you to give 1 or 2 sentences. I know some of you have already said some, right? So let's do it again. So let's do like I would like to invite all 3 distinguished speakers and also 2 co-chair from NECAA, Geqian and Wang Hua, to give closing remark. David, please.
I think I said my piece actually, but again, I would encourage you to think of the power that you have in the unity of this organization to create change and to bring greater attention to this. You know, Lizong rightly pointed out the percentage of the population, but I think when you come to this with one voice, you have much more power regardless of the numbers of the percentages. So don't underestimate that, and do take advantage of that and build on that.
I totally echo with what David said. I think understand ourselves, take care of ourselves, cultivate our self-confidence, at the same time reaching out, ally with other groups. That's the future. That's really our only way to gain equality for ourselves and for everyone, for all the people in the society.
I have a personal message. I start collecting signature for my next round of election. I'm doing right now. Before this meeting, I went to another meeting, collected some signatures. I need 150, but ideally I should have 200. Why? Because some signatures were too sloppy. They could not read. They were thrown away. So you see that. And sometimes I talk to people, unfortunately, they are not even citizens. And so that's the fact. I don't want to advertise this fact to the community, but that's sometimes it's challenging. And, you know, but we have to think this is our home, okay? You come here and you see good education, you see good life, and we have to pay back, okay? That's very critical. And you will gain respect from other people if doing that. And that's why before I was elected 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, I did a lot of community work. I show other people, and people believe me. And otherwise, if you do not do this work, and someday you want to get into politics, people question you, how much you have done for the community? Now you want to get my vote? Are you sure you're the right person? So think about that. I'm being very honest. And I think this time we don't have time to beat around the bush. Let's be honest, get engaged and do something. Thanks again for the time and for attention.
So Geqian, do you want to go first?
So you go first. I follow you.
Are you sure? Okay, yeah. So anyway, yeah, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And really thank you, David, Li Song, and Anping, you know, for a great panel. And Ben, thank you for putting this together. You know, we had a phenomenal one last Thursday, and now this is another one, Roundtable 1-2. I think addressing, you know, really the most important timely topic. Yes, as everybody said, this is the moment. And it's time for us to turn this moment into a movement, right? And so the time to act is now. The American story isn't going to be complete without the history and contributions of AAPI, and indeed all underrepresented groups as well. So I think going forward, let's make good trouble and make good progress. Thank you. Yeah.
So thank you all of you. So it's a great lecture and I learned a lot from you. And I'm looking forward to with all of you in the near future. Thank you.
One word, Ben.
Yeah,
I want to commend
thank you.
NECAA. You guys have done a great job putting together a great series of seminar for this month, this year's Heritage Month. I really appreciate that. I mean, I have shared all your material. You try to really put off other meetings, join yours. I think this is very valuable. Thank you to David, Professor Liu, and Sen. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much. And I have one word to say,
Thank
and
you.
excuse me. So I want to thank you again for David made this possible, this event possible, and also thank you for the my two co-organizers, Professor Li-Song Liu and Dr. Anping Shen, to help organize this event as well as the previous event. And I would like to thank you all the board members of NECAA and to help with this event. My last words is like communication is a science. Communication is an art. Quality and efficient communication helps each mutual understanding, peace, and friendliness. Our effort to add the AAPI history into K-12 education is to enhance the communication and understanding. And it's one society, and we all the ethnic groups and the races are living in. We are different, yes, and we are the same as human beings. We sincerely hope that our human beings' intelligence can lead us to fair, equity, and a better tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a great evening. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Have a good night.
Good.